Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am pleased today to welcome to the show one of my favorite theologians in the entire world, my friend who's actually been on the podcast before. I think with Rodney Hauser. I'm not certain. It's been a while, but Dr. Angela Franks, associate professor of theology, religious studies at the Catholic University of America. Also, are you? I if I used to be in the Academy of Catholic Theology, but I quit when
Ah,
I started the Catholic Worker Farm, and May was always a difficult time for me to come to the. May is a very busy time on the farm, so I relinquished my spot, and I haven't been. But anyway, I did read that you are now the president of ACT for this year, the Academy of Catholic Theology.
yes, you
So,
should rejoin, Larry. You should rejoin.
well, I would love to rejoin. I probably should at this point. So maybe I will. Now that you're president, you can grease the wheels.
Presidential pardon.
Yeah. Where are the conferences held these days?
They're still in DC.
Yeah, they used to be. Where did there's some Franciscan place, I think. They used to be at the
Yeah, they were at a retreat house. We outgrew the retreat house, sadly. But we're still in
Dominican
DC
House of Studies now.
now. Yeah.
Those crazy Dominicans. Okay, that's great. And you are now in Washington, D.C. You got your PhD at Boston College, and you were teaching at St. John's Seminary up in that neck of the woods for many, many, many years. So you are back in Washington, D.C., and I hope you're settled in. Anyway, we're here today to discuss your new book put out by University of Notre Dame Press. Very, very important book called Body and Identity. Subtitle, I think it's called The History of the Empty Self or something along those lines. And in many ways, it's more an act of philosophy than an act of theology, although there's tons of theology in it. To that end, volume two is going to be a more positive theological construction, as you note in the book. Also, it's very philosophical, but it is also what we would call in the trade an intellectual genealogy. And I have to admit, I'm a sucker for intellectual genealogies, whether it's going all the way back to like Louis Dupre or Charles Taylor, or all of them. Intellectual genealogies, I think, are endlessly fascinating, and yours is a fascinating one as well. But anyway, so when you say, um, well, I'll let you frame it the way you want to frame it. The book it took me a long time to wade through it. I don't actually have the text. Normally, I hold it up. Uh, I have to get around to ordering it. You kindly sent me the PDF, and I was scrolling through it. I know that your interest is wide ranging. You've studied von Balthasar. You're an expert in Catholic systematic theology. I've heard you give numerous talks, read many of your papers and books, and it strikes me that one of your overarching concerns, and it's sort of noted in something I read about you, but it comes through in the book. One of your overarching concerns is to place Catholic theology in conversation with many of the mainstream currents of continental philosophy, which is a passion that I kind of share, and I think it's very important. So maybe we could begin the discussion today by framing the at least the beginnings of the conversation in that regard. What aspects of continental philosophy, in particular, with regard to body, identity, notions of the self, do you sort of have in your crosshairs here?
I actually began reading the postmoderns through John Paul II. It was inadvertent, but he in his theology of the body, he talks about how masculinity and femininity after the fall becomes a task. And I knew from his other work, how interested he was in theater, and from my work on Balthasar. Balthasar talks a lot about a theodrama. So it seemed to me as though JP2 was interested in this idea of performance somehow. But I knew that somebody in recent thought talked a lot about performance and performativity. And so that actually led me to Judith Butler, who was the
Uh,
first postmodern. I didn't study. We read like one essay in Derrida in my entire postgraduate history over two institutions. I didn't study any postmoderns. And so this was, I through JP2 I began to get interested in it. And what became clear to me is that the postmoderns are really the exclamation point, in a sense, at the end of this modern history around the person. And I wanted to focus really on the body, but as I looked more on the body, it became so clear to me that it is, as John Paul II says, the expression of the person. And so I had to really spend a lot of time with the anthropology in order to be able to address the body correctly. And the postmoderns were just this high point, in a sense, of a denial of personal identity, the famous, postmodern death of the subject. But I realized that that was not, that was actually just taking modernity to an extreme, a lot of the philosophical trends within modernity, as opposed to coming up with something completely new. So, so I wanted to address the postmoderns in part by trying to excavate what's good, like what's good in their intentions, because people find their thought compelling. And so if people find it compelling, it has to be presenting an answer to a question that's really pressing. And I disagree with most aspects of the answers that they present, but I think that they're really helpful in getting us to the question.
That's true. And what's great about your book is that, yeah, it's very clear that you're not happy with the answers that they give to the questions that we pose to them. But nevertheless, you do so in a manner that is respectful of them and gives them their due as to what they're about. Um, but I want to come back. I'm sort of anticipating a few things here, and my mind is now racing in a million different directions. I have all these notes in front of me, and I always ignore them. I don't know why, but the, what strikes me, you mentioned about sort of postmoderns and their sort of notions of the self. One of the things that I've always wondered, in reading some of the postmoderns is there is there deconstruction of our concepts of the self and identity in particular? Is that simply existentialism run to seed on massive steroids? It's anti-essentialism, or is it something darker, something more nihilistic, more there is no such thing as the self. It's an illusion. So, and maybe you could comment on that.
They definitely argue the latter, that the self is an illusion. So for somebody like Deleuze, it's the sediment of it's like the after effect of all of our desire, that it sort of composes together and looks like a self. I think out of all the ones I read, I think Althusser, Louis Althusser, the Marxist, post structuralist, sort of postmodern Marxist, was the most nihilistic, very nihilistic. But arguably, you already find those nihilistic elements in existentialism. At least that's what recent readers of Sartre, who are in favor of the
Yes.
nihilism, that's what they're arguing. And it seems to me plausible that you definitely find the seeds of it there. Um, I think that really, again, it's like really just the long trajectory of modern thinking on the self, that the self is given less to be and more to do. And when that happens, the self gets evacuated out from the inside. And so that what we're left with, as I argue in my subtitle, is an empty self, but that the seeds of that already began within modernity. And there's aspects of current identity, I argue, that go all the way to Christianity, not the nihilism, but there's so postmodernity is downstream of a lot of different influences, but it says the quiet thing out loud finally.
It sure does. So the is then for the more nihilistic elements here, is our concept of the self merely epiphenomenal, like like foam on a sea wave, having no significance, or is it at least something more than epiphenomenal? In other words, it is the sort of accidental byproduct of the culmination of our desires and our pragmatic decisions and so forth. Uh, Nevertheless, perhaps it does reach something of some kind of reality, some kind of cohesion that's more than simply a concatenation of epiphenomenal characteristics. Do you know what I'm asking? I don't know.
So explicitly, the self is epiphenomenal for them. It's the residue of, for
Yeah.
Deleuze, of our desires. For Foucault, it's what power wants us to think exists. For Butler, it's what we perform into being. But it's ephemeral because you can always perform differently. So explicitly for all of them, it is just the illusion of selfhood. Whether or not they consistently, as human beings, live that way, I would say no, because I think that's impossible. So there's obviously an inner tension in even in their works, but also in their lives. Like Judith Butler will frequently bemoan the fact that she has to use the pronoun I. But in fact, her works are full of the pronoun I, and she's always
Yeah.
proposing these questions, these that she never quite answers. But it's like she poses a question instead of making a statement. Like, is it possible that the self is just the epiphenomenon of our performances? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. But as a along the way of posing those, she keeps using the word I. And so she does quote Nietzsche at one point, who says that it's this that we can never truly, or maybe I'm adding this. She does quote Nietzsche quite a bit, but at one point Nietzsche says we can't truly get rid of God until we've gotten rid of grammar, and that's because of this persistence of the I that exists within the very structure of our language. And so there's always
Yeah.
this tension, but what they explicitly desire is to make the self just this epiphenomenon.
Yeah. I'm reminded, since I've written a book on this, but I'm reminded of as well Darwinists and neo-Darwinists who routinely say there's no such thing as teleology in evolution. No teleology, no teleology, no teleology, and yet they cannot escape speaking in teleological categories. They keep coming back to teleological categories. And that should tell them something, but apparently it doesn't. It doesn't. But anyway, so I'm putting the cart way before the horse here. You end up talking about all these things about the self and identity stuff. But I want to your book is a genealogy, and it is an intellectual genealogy, not a cultural genealogy or institutional genealogy. It's a genealogy of the evolution of ideas. So maybe you can walk us through how did we get, say, from pagan antiquity through the Christian development of the concept of the person in, say, the great Christological and Trinitarian debates, and then the devolution and dissolving of that Christian onto synthesis with Greek classicism in modernity and then postmodernity. I know that's a lot, but that's kind of what your book deals with. So maybe go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, the book was originally I was going to have it one historical chapter, and then I was like, maybe I'll have two,
Yeah.
and then I was like, it has to be a whole book.
Yeah,
Shoot,
it's got a whole
darn
bunch
it.
of historical chapters. Yeah, but they're
Yeah,
great. It's a great
thank you,
book.
thank you. Yeah, it's just we haven't had somebody do it who knows the theology. There's been a lot of philosophers who have tried to write this kind of history, and I've learned from them tremendously. It's been hugely helpful. People like Taylor and Dupre and the people you mentioned, um,
Yeah.
but but especially Taylor and some of the other philosophers are just really innocent of the Christian history. So so what I found, I had kind of imbibed the idea that was sort of out there in academia that you don't really have subjects until modernity. And then I began researching it and realized that was totally false. That the language
Yeah.
of subjectivity might be fairly recent, but that the from the very beginning of when people began to talk philosophically, you have people who are interested in themselves as a self and in others as subjects, and we use the word identity for this. Now, that did not get pulled into use until John Locke to signify what we now mean by identity. But
Okay.
one of the tasks of the book was to show that people are talking about what we mean by identity before they're using the word. And what you see in antiquity is the development of three different kinds of identity in our language. So endurance through time, the fact that I will be the same person tomorrow I was myself yesterday, which is the kind of the earliest strand of thinking that develops. The second is what the Platonists would call the true self. Like
Right.
when the Delphic oracle says, know thyself, what are you knowing when you know yourself?
No, they
And then
sucked.
what's that?
I was just quoting the Greek. Go ahead.
Yes, gnothe se auton, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the third kind of identity is how we reflect upon that true self. So that this is where consciousness comes in. So it's a very modern phenomenon to say consciousness is identity. It's the kind of thing you hear at like the more pastoral level when people have relatives who go through dementia and they say they're not there anymore. And what they mean by that is like they're presumably their loved one is not capable of reflecting upon themselves and remembering their whole history and so forth. So that third aspect of identity is lost, but they really are still there, right? Like, and that's the sense of this more ontological reality of identity. So you get those developed in, ancient Greece. The this the the true self, so that middle part of identity, takes on very what Zygmunt Bauman calls solid categorizations, right? So if you're going to know yourself, you have to know that you are not the gods. You have to know where you fit in the cosmic hierarchy. You need to know what city you belong to, like what class you're part of. But these are all things that are really external, and you're just settling yourself into these categories appropriately. It's really with Christianity that those solid categories, when it comes to identity, become liquefied because they're still good and important and necessary in the sense that you have to know where you fit in the cosmic hierarchy to know who you are. But what you get in Christianity and even in later Judaism is this sense of a personal call from God. That what constitutes me is not first and foremost where I fit into the cosmos, the nation states, the cities, whatever. But what constitutes me first and foremost is the person who God wants me to be. And this liquefying tendency is buttressed by this solid identity and by these institutions for really, over a millennium. But what modernity does is embrace the liquidity and throw out the divine content, the theological content, so that now I have to find out who I am just within this context of pure freedom, not bound by any institution and not normed by God's idea for me. And this is where the self really becomes liquefied and emptied out because we really don't have any resources at this point to figure out who we are.
Wow, that is a great way to nutshell something. I swear that is. I can tell you're a teacher and you've actually taught this stuff because that was a great Nietzsche. I mean that. Who was it? Who was the philosopher who came up with the phrase "liquid modernity"?
Bauman, Zygmunt
Bauman.
Bauman.
That's yeah, Bauman. That Rod Dreher quotes all the time. That's a kind of different concept than what you're talking about here, but it relates to all of this. What's fascinating to me when I was reading this in your text is I think there are very few authors out there. There are some, especially in the continental tradition, but very few authors in the Anglosphere who would talk about how the Christian concept of personhood and the personal vocation from God liquefies certain classical essentializing categories. I found that to be an utterly fascinating part of this book because I think it really is a unique scholarly contribution to this conversation to point out that Christianity is not this. This is so important, so important. Christianity is not a hyper essentializing religion, although it pays homage to essences and so forth. I mean, you mentioned in your book, Charles Taylor skips over from Augustine and then right to the modern, just goes right over the medievals. And of course, the medievals were about essence and form and all those sorts of things. but it's very sophisticated. So maybe you could go back and dilate on that and just a bit about what is it about the coming together of a concept of salvation history and God's dealing with humans in history, God becoming a human being in time and space and calling us east to a personal vocation. How does that liquefy the hyper essentialism of the classical world?
Yeah, I think you see that beautifully in somebody like Augustine, who is drawing from this very rich Neoplatonic philosophical heritage in a lot of ways, but also has this acute realization that we are persons in history and that God has entered into history in this definitive way in Jesus Christ that changes history and that says something about the individual as an embodied unity moving through history. So history is not an important category for a Platonist because, as you say, like the important thing are the universals, the essences, the ideas, and everything down here is to varying degrees a copy and maybe even a very dim copy of like what's really real. And Augustine realized that his story, for example, that he relates in the Confessions, like he has these beautiful reflections at the end that people often skip when they're teaching it to undergrads on time and memory, but
Me.
it's it's totally understandable. But I mean, the reason those wind up in the confession is because he's connecting his history and his story to this larger cosmic history and cosmic story, and he's recovering the capacity for time to contain the eternal, which is exactly what happens in the incarnation. And so you also get with Augustine in this narrative approach to his life a sense that the this particular events in an individual life are valuable and have meaning, even if they're not universalizable. And that's the part of this Christian instinct that God is deeply concerned with me as an individual and has a precise mission for me as an individual. And so that it doesn't mean that Christianity liquefies all of the metaphysics and all of the things that are necessary to understand that. So Christianity is a balance between this more solid, recognizing that God creates creation with a certain order that's intelligible, but also this liquefying aspect of the importance of the individual, which is unpredictable. You can't, when a child is born, you can't just predict, oh, this is what this child's mission is, because it's not something you just draw from the universal structures of things. So when I was presenting this once to a conference, and a priest came up to me afterwards, and he had worked as a missionary in China, and he said, what you are talking about, this liquefying aspect of Christianity and the importance of the individual, is exactly what the Chinese government senses about Christianity and fears in it. And I thought that because we
Wow.
think, we're in the modern West, we think, oh, well, Christianity's stodgy and totally institutional and solid and all of that. But in China, they're like, no, Christianity emphasizes individual freedom and dignity, and it's inherently liquefying and destabilizing.
That is utterly fascinating. That's a great story. I'm glad you told that story because these are the kinds of things that really leapt out to me about the text is this nuancing of Christianity as occupying this sort of liminal space in between modern secularity and ancient classical thought. It's a very Balthasarian, very ressourcement sort of view to take. Of course, you've been heavily influenced by von Balthasar. How influenced were you as well in this concept of vocational call by Balthasar, missioning? I mean, that's Balthasar very Ignatian and all that sort of stuff. We don't have to necessarily dwell on that, but maybe you could mention that briefly.
That was actually one of the oldest insights that I came to about this whole topic of identity because I taught for many years Theodrama 3 by Balthazar. I just taught it in the fall.
Yeah.
And so in Theodrama 3, he really lays out how Jesus's person is his mission ontologically, and how for the rest of us, our life purpose is to approach that mission as best we can. And that was the insight that identity is about mission. When you're
Yeah.
talking about that true self, like what you're talking about is mission, and that's how we find our identity. And so it's actually deeply stealthily Balthasarian, this book, and it'll be the
Well,
next one will be much
yeah.
more explicitly Balthasarian.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more revolutionary ideas that shocked me when I was doing my dissertation on Balthasar is this very subtle distinction he makes, not quite really, I think, completely fleshed out even by him, but where he makes this distinction between like my psychological self, which is a real thing, a real subject, but then we don't really become theological persons until we know our mission and are working in our mission. And that is a really sort of radical concept in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think piecing out the three different aspects of identity helps to kind of show where Balthazar's insight fits in, because the this first kind of identity through time is a very metaphysical reality, and Balthazar
Yeah.
is a very metaphysical thinker, and when it comes to his metaphysics, he's pretty deeply Thomistic, and so he's very comfortable with that metaphysical baseline, and then that conscious awareness of our mission, which is sort of that psychological self you're talking about. He spends a lot of time talking about consciousness in Theodrama
Yeah,
3, but he says
it does.
Jesus's consciousness is identical with his mission, and that's what we need to be if we're going to be if we're going to become whole human beings. That's the goal for us, that our what we bring to consciousness is more and more this understanding of the mission that God has given us.
That's interesting. And those for those interested, I mean, my dissertation was essentially a rolling meditation or exposition of volumes 4 and 5 of the Theological Aesthetic, which is sort of his intellectual genealogy from, classical metaphysics into modern metaphysics. But then those categories really show up dynamically in both Theodrama 3 and then in the Theologic. It just explodes. But anyway, this isn't a conversation about von Balthasar, but it's in my wheelhouse, so I thought I'd bring it up. Okay, so we're talking now about identity and the Christian concept and so on, how modernity embraces the sort of liquefaction aspects of it, but not the theological aspects of it. And so we get to this modern situation of the evacuated self, the empty self. You mentioned in here somewhere, I don't remember, where you talk about the fact that we do live in a narcissistic age. So you would think, well, that's not an empty self, right? Narcissism would seem to be a very full self. But you have this great little thing in here where you talk about, no, narcissism is the exact opposite of a full self.
Yeah, it was also teaching. I taught for a little bit Christopher Lash's A Culture of Narcissism, which just,
Yes.
was written, I think it came out in 78. But it just becomes more and more relevant. I just also taught that like about a month ago to some undergrads, and I was like, this was written in the late 70s. What do you think? And they were like, this is entirely what surrounds us, this kind of reality.
Yeah.
And he's very clear there, and it's clear if you just study narcissism in general that narcissism is the activity of narcissists that we think of, like, wanting to inject themselves into conversations or making everything about them or whatever. That these are coping strategies to paper over the insubstantiality that's at their core. And so Lash calls it the void within. There's like this void within, and that's actually like a really psychologically dangerous thing to be in. When I was teaching it, it struck me how what the postmodernists were championing, this kind of empty, epiphenomenal self, that actually psychologists, when they experience that, when people are showing those kinds of symptoms, psychologists recognize that as being hugely disabling. It's a really, it's a personality disorder, and those are actually very difficult to treat, from what I understand. And so, we're kind of it's like what the postmodernists were theorizing, people who had never read the postmodernists were manifesting exact at the same time, exactly that kind of self. And it's not a good place to be, you know, but my argument is that like we're all sort of on the narcissistic spectrum, that's what it means. Like there are to talk about a culture of narcissism, like that we're all there. There are definitely pathological narcissists that are their own thing, but we all sort of reflect. We're driven by our culture, Lash argues, to have these narcissistic strategies. And what I try to develop in the book is like the longer, deeper history to that. That it's not just
You do.
television or something, but like that there's a longer story.
Oh yeah, it's not just television, it's not just the digital age, it's not just oh we're all attached to our iPhones. These have all become sort of cliches at this point, and AI is going to take over everything and blah blah blah. Yeah, but I think that ignores the deeper questions that you're addressing in here. One of the things that lurking in the background in all of this to me is Nietzsche. I'm sorry, Nietzsche is everywhere in my mind these days. So much of my, and I'll talk about myself briefly. So much of my theological concern. I don't have a project. I'm not academic enough to have a project anymore. I'm a bit of a dilettante. But my theological concern is with the many, many ways in which modernity represents a negation of Christianity. That and that the theological task of today involves a raw, honest, almost brutal confrontation or encounter with or dialogue with all of those elements of negation. And what characterizes modernity, it seems to me, is an almost ultimate negation of the very core of what Christianity represents. And I don't mean existence of God and all that sort of the core metaphysical existential worldview of Christianity is what is challenged by this empty self, by this concept of the self as an illusion. Uh, so and a lot of it is tied up then too with post-liberalism. I don't even know what post-liberalism is anymore or liberalism. Um, it seems to me that so many postmoderns who share this concept of the liquid self, the empty self, the self-defining self, the epiphenomenal self, so many of them still continue to talk politically in the language of rights, in the language of entitlement, in the language of liberalism. And yet, classic liberalism would not completely embrace this total liquefaction of the self. And so I know this is a lot of gobbledygooky ideas, but maybe you could riff on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I think that modernity, kind of as it did with morality, when it came to identity and the self, modernity unwittingly just thought it could coast along on the residues of Christianity and the institutional solids that modernity was also trying mightily to liquefy. But there was like, just like morality, it's like, well, we'll get rid of formal cause and final cause. We'll get rid of understanding human nature, but people will just naturally still be good moral people, right? And of course, that's
Yeah.
not how it works because what we know is that it's precisely Christianity that introduces these understandings of the equality, the equal dignity of all persons rooted in their one human nature. And without Christianity supporting modern morality, but also modern identity, we do wind up with this very liquefied self. So I don't think the moderns that I especially treat Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, and I don't
Yeah.
think they would read Deleuze and be like, "That's what I want." Like I think they would be horrified in a lot of ways, but it's what they set up because
Yeah.
this focus on liquefying, getting rid of form, getting rid of meaning, therefore getting rid of final causality, and getting rid, therefore, of purpose. You get rid of meaning, you get rid of purpose, um, and you've simultaneously said, don't form your identity on all of these solid institutions, which was an originally Christian intuition. Now what do you have left? And so like you do, like they're chipping away at everything that provides the substrate for personal identity. So I didn't talk
Uh,
about Nietzsche, but I don't know. I can
no,
get to
I
Nietzsche.
know. No, you didn't, which is why I brought him up because I think that his presence is nevertheless lurking behind so much of what you're talking about here. But
I
let's go
bring him
back.
up. I brought him up when I talk about Jane Austen,
Oh,
which
that's
was,
right.
yeah,
That's a fascinating part of the book. I
yeah,
love Jane Austen. I'm.
yeah, yeah. I was trying to argue that so one of the terms I develop is the doxic self, the idea that drawing from Plato that our appearance, our exterior, um, becomes the entire person in modernity, basically,
Yes,
because we can't talk about a formal or final reality to the person. We don't have Christian content anymore to identity. And so what becomes more and more important is how what the person does, which is very clear in Kant, like that, your appearance, it that's where, like the noumenal world, like we just don't know anything about, right? And so where all the action happens is the moral activity of the self. And so Austin is writing, you know, around the fair, just really shortly after Kant has published his most
yes,
influential works. And I don't know that she read Kant or was familiar with any of that, but what you see in Austin's fiction is the whole dynamic of like what happens when um, the most significant question you have to ask is this person really who they appear to be? So she's very concerned with the doxic self and very concerned with how dangerous that is for single women who, have to rely on whether or not this person is trustworthy and truly virtuous. And so her villains tend to be the ones who appear to be virtuous but aren't really virtuous. And so I argue
that's
like
so true.
she's writing at the beginning of a century that by the end you have Nietzsche who's saying that, that little changeling, the subject, it's just an illusion, like what really exists is the will to power. And the will to power in kind of Deleuzian terms might kind of congeal into subjects here and there, but there's nothing, again, it's totally epiphenomenal. There's nothing really substantial there. And he has a lot of contempt for the idea of a subject. And Austin is showing, kind of like Lasch will show 150 years later, that we really need subjects. Like otherwise
Yeah,
we're just negotiating a world of falsehoods, which is precisely what she's opposing.
absolutely. And I love that section of your book because I've always been a big Jane Austen fan. Um, I was introduced to her at the University of Nebraska as an undergraduate, and I, I I had to go back as an adult and reread her because as you know, a 19-year-old at the University of Nebraska, I didn't completely appreciate the depth of of what she was trying to say, but later on I did. But anyway, now let's tie this. What does all of this have to do with the body? I mean, obviously, the elephant in the living room is the modern transgender movement and concept of gender identity and gender fluidity. And, I can have top surgery, I can have bottom surgery, I can pump myself full of synthetic hormones to make myself the opposite sex. There's about 800 different gender identities, blah, blah, blah. So obviously, there's a crisis in our culture with regard to what is the body and what is the relationship of the self to the body. So let's get into the significance then of the body in all of this.
Yeah, again, I was thinking I was going to talk a lot more about the body when I started this, and then I realized the gender crises were one of the spurs to my thinking to help me clarify the fact that what we think are body problems in our culture are very often identity problems. It was just really clear to me that,
Yeah, that
that
becomes clear, and I don't mean to interrupt, that
yeah,
your focus in the book is on the identity issue and the self issue, and the body issue comes sort of downstream of that. Anyway, go ahead.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I realized is that what we project onto our bodies identity problems by and large. And in when I was growing up, it wasn't transgenderism, it was eating disorders, right? It's
Hmm.
like, people have psychological and spiritual crises that they're solving by projecting those onto their body. So, what I argue at the beginning of the book to basically explain why I'm not talking more about the body in the rest of the book, is that the body in modernity has become what I call a totem. Meaning, so I get this from Freud, who probably is wrong when it comes to primitive cultures, but as a psychological idea, I think it's really helpful, that totems distract us from our problems, they fascinate us, and ultimately we decide to sacrifice them. So that's what happens with the totemic animal in primitive tribes, that,
Yeah.
that's the thing that they kind of invest with their identity often winds up being sacrificed in some kind of ritual sacrifice. And I thought, that's exactly what we're doing with the body, because we're so focused on appearance, that this kind of long history has led to this emphasis on appearance, that the body is the thing onto which we project our problems. And I think that's partly because it seems easier. It seems easier to, as difficult and painful as all of the gender altering surgeries and hormones and everything are, like, and they really are difficult and painful, it still feels easier than dealing with the really painful things that are causing this identity disruption within us. And so we decide to fiddle with the bodies. And so we in a sense both idolize and demonize our bodies, because we expect them to do something that they cannot, which is to solve our identity problems. And then when they don't do that, we rebel against them and, treat them as nothing, as something to be manipulated or to be abandoned if we can. So I think that's the body pathology that's going alongside our identity problems.
Well, I know that as I age and I get fatter and balder and uglier, that my body has betrayed my identity big time.
And I mean, that stuff is real, right? Like, our bodies are finite and they
Yeah, yeah.
do push back, right? But that's part of their value,
Well,
honestly.
I'm only half joking. There was a time, maybe it was about, I'm 67. It was about maybe when I turned 60, 61, where I looked at myself in the mirror. It's when I had started shaving my head for the first time because I was going very bald and wrinkles on my, and I looked at and I said, who the hell is that? Who is that? That's not my self-concept. That's not who I think I am, but that's what I look like. And it's part of aging is adjusting to that body identity crisis as well, where we
Yeah.
yeah, where we can age gracefully or we can run off and get Botox and plastic surgery and facelifts and all kinds of other crazy things to sort of make sure that my body matches my youthful identity. I'm also reminded of Walker Percy's great book, Lost in the Cosmos, where in the very beginning he says, when somebody shows you a group photo and you're in it, your eyes automatically go to yourself. Or you see yourself in the reflection of glass as you're walking down the street in a supermarket or something, and you're taken aback. And Percy says, "Well, why? Don't you know what you look like?" There is a sense, therefore, in other words, what I see in my body is not who I am. And there is that inherent sort of tension, let's put it that way, if not dualism, has fueled all kinds of different ideological responses to that. Uh,
Yeah.
so anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I love Lost in the Cosmos. Like, I think
Yeah,
it's a really profound book. Yeah, I just think it's wonderful.
yeah, I do too.
In Theology of the Body, John Paul II talks about how the fall creates an interior fracture where we feel this distance from our bodies and we scapegoat our bodies. And so I think this is a problem that goes all the way back to the fall. but it's something that does get accelerated in modernity because, again, like our sense of ourself is so rooted in how we appear. And so, which I think, well, people didn't have ordinary, humble peasants did not have mirrors. So like you might not have a very good sense of what you looked like. It's not like there was a lot of plate glass windows or
Yeah.
something around. So the fact that we even know what we look like, to Percy's point, is a kind of modern phenomenon. But it also just our appearances have become more and more important because again we're given less to be. Our identity is not found in what we are, it's found more and more in what we do. And so it's this very outward facing understanding of identity, this kind of anti-metaphysical understanding that just elevates out of all proportion the importance of our appearance. And our appearance is part of who we are. Like our bodies are part of who we are, but they are finite and changing. And so that's part of the painful aspect about being embodied, that we're constantly being reminded that we can't just look however we want. We can't just be whoever we want to be, and
Yeah.
that's painful.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say that I identify as a handsome 25-year-old Adonis athlete, but that would be totally out of step with the reality of the situation that I simply need to accept. Uh, and yet, so okay, let me back up. So what then is the Christian anthropology with regard to all of this? You've referenced John Paul's theology of the body. This has tremendous significance, I think, this Christian anthropology.
Yeah, and that's more for the future book. But
Right.
the what the Trinitarian, and even more so, which I've come to appreciate since I wrote this book, the Christological councils developed this intricate and rich metaphysics of personal identity that really had to be developed by Christians. The Greek pagans had not done it. And because of the exigencies of making sense of both the Trinity and of Jesus Christ, Christians had to develop that. So that gives us the baseline for who we are, a kind of this ontological anchor in all of the liquidity that there is this baseline reality of who we are. Um, and then what Christianity adds to that is that particularizing identity content that pertains to me as a particular body soul entity. So, one of the interesting things that you see in Thomas Aquinas's anthropology is the idea that the soul becomes commensurated with the body, and he doesn't
Yes.
treat it at a lot of depth, but there's this sense in which the body as this particular matter affects, so to speak, the soul. It molds the soul, like the soul and the body kind of mold together so that they fit each other. And so that's the metaphysical reality at the basis of something like our resurrected bodies, that so we will get our bodies back. It's not just our souls that are immortal, but our souls are yearning for and fit our particular body. And so our identity has to take into account all of these realities. It can't be just something general and universal, but it has to be rooted in the general and universal metaphysical truths of being an embodied human being. And so that's what provides us with the structure, and the God's call, our mission, provides us with the content.
That's brilliantly put. And I can't wait for volume two of this, where you get into all of the sort of positive theological proposals, where you sort of construct this Christian anthropology to answer a lot of this. Okay, but we have, maybe 10, 15 minutes left here. What then, we've talked about the intellectual genealogy with regard to the concept of the self, and what modernity says about that. But with regard to our bodies, it seems like there's a genealogy there as well. I did, in my book on science and religion many decades ago, I went through a kind of genealogy where you find the destruction of the medieval synthesis beginning with nominalism. This is all very cliche at this point. And then going through Newtonian mechanics and so forth. The point is, it does seem like our bodies and our concept of the body suffered under a kind of Newtonian paradigm and then the Darwinian paradigm. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how did we get from point A to point Z with regard to this notion that body is just this instrument that we can play around with as we see fit.
Yeah, I identify one of the intellectual shifts that caused that unfortunate result in the rejection by modernity of formal and final causality. And so if you think of these in terms of meaning and purpose, the body becomes detached from any reality of meaning and any purpose beyond just utilitarian purpose. And so this is one of the things that's kind of shocking in Descartes, really, is how utilitarian that he
Yeah.
is. And at one point
Yeah.
he's like, and actually everything should be, this is in Discourse on Method, everything should be for the purpose of serving health, and which is crazy because he's just told us how our bodies are totally distinct substances from our persons, and yet we should be spending all of this time and intellectual focus on preserving the health of these bodies. So it's an interesting prediction that has cashed out in many ways, but it's partly because our bodies just become viewed as raw material, that because they don't have any inherent form or meaning, then we have to make them meaningful. And I saw a lot of this language. I've done work on contraception, and even
Yes.
theologians within the church who are arguing in favor of contraception being understood as moral, as a moral act. Those theologians were really arguing with that kind of Cartesian language, that the body and its fertility is chaotic and formless and meaningless, and we impose form and order on it through something like hormonal contraception. And that's just a real misunderstanding of our bodies as being who I am, and therefore bound up with the meaning that I have as an embodied human person with dignity.
What's interesting, yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the great debates in the late 60s, even though I was a very young man, like in 68, 69, I was just 10 or 11. But I do remember, when I went to university later on and stuff, the debates where Charles Curran and the proportionalists accused, those theologians like Germain Grisey and others of who supported Humanae Vitae, who supported the church's teaching on human sexuality. Curran and the other proportionalists accused them of biologism. Biologism, that you want to, in other words, the idea that our bodies have natural teleologies, natural law, natural teleologies that we have to unpack and we have to respect, and we develop a whole moral theory based on those teleologies, which goes way beyond simply the old perverted faculty sorts of arguments, because there's a lot of meaning embedded in those teleologies, as John Paul brings out in his theology of the body, as did Grisey. All right, but biologism, and yet they were the ones guilty of the biologisms, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's why I think for John Paul II in Theology of the Body, one of the key, really the key idea is the spousal meaning of the body. And that's this attempt to return formal causality and meaning to the body, not as something independent of me, which is sort of how these proportionalists were thinking about it, right?
Yes.
That like they thought if you talk about the meaning of the body, you mean like you're just going to let your theology be dictated by the random biological
Yeah.
processes of the body. And what JP2 is saying is like, no, the body has a meaning because it's the body of a person who is ordered and created for self-gift, and the body reveals that, and so it's actually bound up in this web of meaning. It's not meaningless, and therefore it's not purposeless. It has meaning and purpose. So yeah, those
Yeah.
are the kind of where the you see these practically work themselves out, how these, very abstract ideas about my detachment from my body or the body not having meaning, what this concretely means are these sorts of things, or something like embryonic stem cell research, because, little embryos are just, the only question is like, how useful are they? They don't have meaning on their own,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Yeah.
there's very practical consequences.
Yeah. I remember there was a colleague of mine at DeSales University. I won't mention his name because I liked him very much, a biology teacher, also a practicing Catholic, who over lunch with Rodney Hauser and I, we were debating stem cell research, and he was in favor of it, even though he's Catholic. And he goes, look, all I know is this: when I look at an embryo under a microscope, I know that's not a human being. You know, there's no way that that's the metaphysical equivalent of a mature adult. And yet that is, well, in some ways, you're right. We're not saying it's completely equivalent in all ways, but it is metaphysically dignified in an, in a deeply spiritual way that you can't violate, because that's a person there. And so who was guilty then in that conversation of biologism, of an instrumentalizing of the embryo rather than seeing it in its dignity? And it seems to me that that's what's at stake here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's that our bodies have the capacity to reveal the person, and this is the the depth of this becomes perfected in the incarnation and in the Eucharist, where Christ's body now has the capacity to mediate his person, to represent and mediate him. And that's what the iconoclastic controversies are about. Can the visible mediate the invisible and really reveal it? And it's this great Christian distinctiveness to emphasize the importance of that bodily visible mediation.
Yeah, and here is where Christianity is still grounded in a sort of classical metaphysical. No, we don't believe that we're just sort of bad mimeograph copies of a higher form or whatever. But the sacramental and iconic elements is precisely, I think, the genius and the insight of John Paul's theology of the body. The realization that the spiritual is mediated through the material in our bodies is, once again, we're getting into sort of theological anthropology here. We're sort of anticipating the next volume of your book. But this is precise. Let's bring it back in the few minutes we have left here. What what then is going to be the downstream consequences of this, both this hyper destruction of the self combined with whatever's left of the self having a dualistic relationship, extrinsic, as David L. Schindler said, an extrinsic relationship with the body, all right, coupled then with a hyper instrumentalization of our notion of the body, coupled with AI and digital everything. Where are we going, Angela? Where is this headed?
Yeah, well, not anywhere good, right? I mean, so like what I think we see that people on all sides complain about is that there's been this rise of identity politics, and that's very predictable because we're supposed to construct our own identity. We have no help from God or from structures or from anything. And so people just go to, like, instead of sewing it themselves, they go and buy a ready-made suit, which they normally find online, in some kind of identity corner of the internet. And we
Yeah.
see this among Catholics, right? We see this among like left wing or right wing Catholics, right? Like there's an identity that I'm going to take on, and there are very concrete steps that you have to take. There's certain things you have to buy very often. There's certain beliefs you have to have. Sourdough bread often seems to be part of it. I haven't figured that out, but it's like, so that I think anything on that kind of spectrum is just going to get more accelerated, where people are going to do what it takes to find an identity to answer that "who am I" question. And sometimes it can be really outrageous. People have plastic surgeons implant horns in their forehead so that they can identify as a bull or something. Like these kinds of things exist. So, but
Or
definitely the
cat eyes.
yeah, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Transhumanism is going to try to push this as far as it can, where it's going to be the important part of me is my consciousness, and I'm going to upload that, whatever the heck that is supposed to mean, and the bionic person, or I'm going to be this cyborg kind of melded with things that upgrade my body, but also upgrade my brain. So people are going to continue to try to do that, I think. And people already have a sense of how destructive and crazy that is, I think, but they often don't know why. And I think this is where Christianity can really be of service to people.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I was laughing very much at your sourdough thing because you're looking at a man who has recently made an attempt at making sourdough. And this morning I had to scrub it all off my hands. I was slicing up beets. My hands were all red because I'm now into fermenting my own sauerkraut, fermented beets, fermented carrots, eating sourdough bread, because apparently that's all good for your biodome, your gut biome, or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, a large part of that, and I'll bring it back to our conversation, is as I age and the reality of mortality becomes ever more real, you start grasping at all these straws like, well, this will be the longevity elixir that will keep this machine running for a while. So it does strike me that more and more and more, the more we atheistic we become, culturally speaking, the more materialistic, the more instrumentalizing we do of the body. At the same time, the body has its revenge, and everybody still seems to want to. I'm trapped in this machine, but I want to make sure this machine really is working well. And then likewise, there is a sense I sense in all of it of a deep truth of the Christian faith, which is a desire for immortality. Whether they want to, you can be as sophisticated and as lightened and as stoic as you want to be. Like, well, I don't fear death. I'm an adult and I embrace its real bullshit. You know what? You're afraid of it. And everything about our culture screams like I'm going to upload my consciousness into a computer. That wouldn't be you, by the way.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that misunderstands computers and consciousness anytime people
A
are
little
saying
bit.
that. Yeah. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with taking care of our health and everything as long
Yeah,
as that
yeah,
is relativized, as long as it's not is it's when we invest these things with all of this identity productive weight
yeah,
that they become unbalanced because like the truth is that I am not, how I appear to the world in this superficial kind of way. Like the my identity has to be deeper than that. And it's reflected, my body is the tangible edge of my identity, but my identity has to involve a lot more interiority than just simply the kind of wellness maxing sort of things that we're doing in order
yeah.
in order that we appear good to other people, that we look good, whatever that means. And it's just so superficial. We're settling for the superficial.
Well, yeah. I gave up on looking good a long time ago, but I'll at least try to feel better. Let's at least try
And
to
that's
feel better.
fine.
Yeah, you know who really got me into doing sourdough, believe it or not, was Joe Fessio, Father Fessio. He's into sourdough, and my friend Cy Brewster up in Connecticut, but Fessio was the first one. So anyway, I'm sorry, I don't mean to dwell on that, but that really tickled my funny bone when you brought that up because I think it's a spot on, a spot on observation, Angela. All right, we're sort of out of time. And my apologies for the very unsystematic way that I have approached it. It's a very complex book, and yet also at the same time, I don't want to make it sound like it's incoherent because it is very coherent. It has a nice thread that runs through the whole. But it is a complex book. So my apologies for the maybe unsystematic way that I've unpacked it. But is there anything that we haven't discussed about your text that maybe before we sign off here you want to bring up?
I mean, I think we hit a lot of bases. Yeah, it is an academic book. I tried to make it readable. I think, it's just really helpful to have this longer perspective when we're
Yeah.
thinking about contemporary problems, and it keeps us from exoticizing them too much. It's like, oh, those gender dysphoric people over there, thank heavens I have nothing in common with them. But in fact, we probably do, right? We
We
probably
do.
all have this identity pathology that we're all working through. And so I think that that can be helpful pastorally also because it helps us or helps remind us that this, to pastorally address these issues, what we need to be
Yes.
focusing on is their identity,
Yes. Yes.
affirming the goodness and the truth of who they really are. So I think that would be a
Yeah,
good place to
very
end.
good. Well, and you just gave me a new vocabulary word that I'm going to work in somehow to what I'm writing. Exoticized. That's a great word, to not exoticize these things. We're all infected with the same bacillus of modernity in our own little ways, as I like to say. And so this isn't just about those others. We all have an element of this ideology within us, which is why I think the book is great. And yeah, it's an academic book, and I want people to know that. But one of the great things I have learned about the viewers of my podcast is that they've come to appreciate academic books, which is why I don't shy away from mainly interviewing authors of academic books. And there's a great need for the educated laity in the church and even post-seminary priests and post-school nuns to continue reading academic theology, and there's a thirst for it. And you have made it readable. It's a very readable book. You're a good writer, and so I do encourage people don't not to be scared off by the fact it's an academic text because it's a damn good one. And Angela is a very important figure in the church these days. And I can't thank you enough for coming. This was a delayed pod. We got power issues with the big
Yes.
snowstorm that hit the East Coast, but here we are. So thanks a lot, Angela, for coming on the
Thank
show
you.
today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you. And bye now.